Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 322. This week the questions are taken from guide 395 on HMS Menetheus, the beer making ship, and the Wednesday video on the Goteborg, the replica East Indiaman of Sweden. So let's get on with questions. BK Zhong asks, why was Menetheus used to produce beer and not tea? Well, two primary reasons. Firstly, of course, tea is much more easily transportable, either as leaf or bag tea. It just sits quite happily in dry stores, and then you combine it with boiling water, and you have tea wherever you go. You don't need a ship for that. Well, you need a ship to transport it, but you don't need an entire ship just to make tea. Whereas with beer, as covered in the 5-minute guide, beer does spoil, at least in that time period the channel's covering, over a long period of transportation and storage. Now, a few people in the comments also asked, well, why not just send out IPA, India Pale Ale, because that was designed specifically to last long distances in transportation, hence the name, because it was designed to survive the trip from Britain to India well before the Second World War, when journey times were considerably longer. And the reason that the UK didn't just go, you know what, we'll just produce tons of IPA and send that out to everyone, is twofold. Firstly, IPA, or India Pale Ale, in the Second World War, and plus or minus several decades either side of that, is horrifically bitter. Now, of course, people have varying tastes in beer, but the IPA you get these days is nowhere near as bitter as the IPA of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, yeah, it would be a case of people only drank it because it wasn't stale, not because they liked the taste. And you combine that with the fact that one of the reasons that IPA lasts a bit longer than regular beer is because it tends to have a slightly higher alcohol content. You'd end up giving a bunch of sailors beer which 95% of them probably thought tasted absolutely disgusting, and would get them drunk faster. So, yeah, the public order issues of a bunch of sailors who hate the beer they're drinking but are also getting drunk on it, that's not going to end well. It was much, much easier to make an entire ship that would produce beer freshly in the region, which then, having a lower alcohol content, is less likely to induce drunken riots on a ship, and actually tastes of something other than horrific bitterness. Andre asks, could the US Navy have sold the aircraft carrier medium, aka the CVV, to foreign navies, similar to how the Royal Navy sold the Majestic and Colossus class post-World War II? And if so, what navies could buy or would buy and accept such a ship? Well, I will briefly cover this, mostly because of the comparison to the immediate post-World War II sales that the Royal Navy did. And the short answer is technically yes, something like a CVV would be within the operational capabilities of a couple of navies that the US could have sold one to, but it would have been a very, very limited market. So the French Navy might have accepted purchasing one, or at least theoretically on paper could afford to purchase one, in their case to replace the Clemenceau class, and the Royal Navy could purchase one or two to replace, at that point, Ark Royal and Eagle and, well, Hermes and all the other various smaller carriers, essentially as a kind of somewhat late CVA-01 replacement. However, there are still a couple of major problems with this. Firstly, cost-wise, size-wise, and even complement-wise, the CVV is within shouting distance of something like the John F. Kennedy, the conventionally powered supercarrier, which is only marginally larger but significantly more capable. So you'd be paying a premium price for something that's actually, if you're going to be paying that amount of money, you might as well pay the slight extra that would give you a far more capable vessel. And you've got the whole issue, which both Britain and I believe France has, of not wanting to buy major warships that aren't built in their own shipyards, which would be something of an issue. But the other big problem, which is why, for example, Canada took on some of the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier Program ships instead of Essexes, although they were offered them, is that US carriers, especially the conventionally powered ones, are incredibly manpower intensive for their size compared to, well, honestly, British and French carriers, because they're pretty much the only ones who are building carriers on the Western-NATO side of things in the sort of, well, World War II period and onwards. And that's what made the decision for Canada. Yeah, the Essex class would be slightly more capable, but the sheer amount of crew and therefore cost of running the thing meant it was held to be better to run slightly smaller, slightly less capable carriers because they were infinitely more affordable. And this would have been a double whammy for the CVV, apart from, the foreign-built warships issue for the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale. The other big problem would be, well, firstly, if you are going to buy a foreign warship, as mentioned, you could own and operate a JFK, assuming that the US would sell you one for about the same amount of money, but get more capability. So why would you want the lesser vessel? But secondly, even if on paper, in theory, you could operate such a vessel, the sheer numbers of people that you'd need to operate it would mean that your ongoing life cycle costs would be quite high. So for reference, compared to Ark Royal and Eagle, the CVV was looking at coming in at needing something along the lines of 40 to 50% more crew, despite, even after refits and so forth had dropped the Ark Royal and Eagle's air complement down, despite only offering maybe an additional squadron, so about a 25 to 30% increase in air group. And, that's a fairly big trade-off. And the other reason for covering it is actually, as you can probably appreciate from these facts, it's actually a very good case study in how various warship types, whether they be battleships, cruisers, destroyers, or in this case aircraft carriers, or indeed submarines, tend to have efficiency sweet spots. And you can make a vessel larger than that and get more capability, the square cube law being your friend. However, if you're operating in the vicinity of a construction sweet spot, and there will be quite a few along the chart of displacement, if you drop a little bit below that, you can end up with dramatically less capacity, but almost as much cost. Question mark asks, if Admiral Crutchley had returned to his formation after his meeting with Turner instead of staying with the transports, would HMAS Australia's presence and Crutchley being in charge instead of Bode have changed the outcome? Would Canberra have been allowed to continue damage control instead of its somewhat premature scuttling? Well, there's a whole range of potential possibilities if Australia is there. Now, of course, you could have the rather depressing possibility of, well, if Australia's there, that's a third target for the Japanese, so she gets damaged at least, as, Chicago got hit, and maybe Australia's hit as well as Canberra. That's the pessimistic outcome. Then, as you grade up through varying degrees of optimism, you get the fact that, well, Canberra was pretty much at action stations, had her guns trained out when she was savaged by the Japanese and then also friendly fired by the Bagley. If Australia is only partially damaged and is back on up to action stations at the same rate as Canberra, and there's no reason to think she wouldn't be, then she will actually be able to start firing back at the Japanese. And of course, she has torpedo launchers of her own. And if Crutchley's in command and he's ordering everyone to return fire, then that means in theory Chicago should return fire as well. Now, statistically, Chicago and Australia in a point-blank night engagement should come off worse in the battle, since there's considerably more cruisers armed with heavy guns on the Japanese side than just the Chicago and Australia. However, only Chikai is a 1v1 match. All the others are somewhat older, and of course, you have the fact that initially the Japanese are concentrating on Canberra, and we're assuming for ease of argument that that's what they would probably continue to do. And so that outcome could vary quite considerably depending on who hits who first. Now, Australia has only a Type 286 radar. Now, that's not a gunnery control radar. It's actually an air search radar with a secondary surface search capability. But, as we've established through various videos, the Australian and Royal Navies do actually have a relatively decent night fighting doctrine. So, best case scenario at this point, Australia maybe drops a bunch of 8-inch shells into Chicago first, crippling Chicago, and then starts engaging the other Japanese cruisers. Now, once more, the Japanese, they've got plenty of torpedoes, they've got still a superiority of firepower, they can still probably deal with Chicago and Australia, but they're going to take some fairly significant damage doing so, and at the very least it's going to alert the next group further north of what's coming, which means that at the very least the battle is going to be a draw, if not possibly a loss for the Japanese. However, if you want to get into the more optimistic side of things, although again Australia only has a sort of a somewhat jury-rig surface search radar capability, and in fact Canberra has a better surface search radar, you could make the assumption that perhaps Australia is heading back to the formation at around the same time as the Japanese are coming in. Therefore, perhaps Australia's crews on more alert, and they pick something up. They ask Canberra to check it out. Canberra goes, oh yeah, there's something out there. And therefore, Chicago, Canberra, and Australia are all able to go to action stations or general quarters, depending on your navy, before the Japanese manage to open fire. And if that's the case, if the Australian and American ships are ready for it, then even discounting the presence of friendly destroyers, you've got two chances from the Canberra and Australia to salvo off your own torpedoes, and you have 3 full-spec treaty cruisers able to counterfire the Japanese. Now, in that circumstance, again, it is still possible, due to a plurality of Japanese vessels and therefore guns and torpedoes, that they might still overwhelm the 3 Allied cruisers, albeit once more with damage and with alerting the northern group that something's coming and they should try and deal with it. But it is remotely possible that, let's say, the torpedoes from Australia or Canberra hit and take out Chicago before it can even really do all that much, and they manage to, perhaps under Crutchley's guidance, drop 8-inch shells almost immediately thereafter on 3 other Japanese cruisers, with maybe the other set of torpedoes going wherever, because let's not be too optimistic and say they're both going to hit. That might give them enough of an advantage that the remaining Japanese ships might actually now be at a firepower disadvantage if the Allied group's able to, between torpedoes and guns, essentially cripple 4 Japanese ships almost straight off the bat, maybe even only 3. And of course, because they're alerted, they'll be able to maneuver, potentially avoiding Japanese long lances. So although the majority of cases of Australia being there end with the Japanese probably take significantly more damage, possibly losses, but Australia and Chicago are probably badly damaged themselves, there is a maybe 10-20% chance that Crutchley could lead the Southern Force, if he gets enough alert time, to at least a qualified victory. And with the other cruiser groups around for the Allied formation, there's not really a margin for the Japanese to claw that back. And even if you get something that's pretty much the same outcome as you got historically, Crutchley is very, very unlikely to allow Canberra to be scuttled when there's not really any sign of movement elsewhere. So Canberra at least probably would be saved. Brendan Buersdorf asks, during World War I, the US produced numerous wooden-hulled cargo ships as part of emergency production. How were these ships built? Was it cheap plywood, or was it something more sturdy? And how come no one else tried something similar, especially countries like Japan during say, later in World War II, when they could have made good use of such vessels due to metal supply shortages and cargo ship shortages. They were somewhat more sturdy, although the very limited number that actually saw active service mostly were then used on the coastal trade. That was simply because, well, a steel ship was superior. But for the most part, these vessels were what you might call a composite ship. So if you've been to the dockyards in Chatham, for example, in the UK, you'll see HMS Gannet, which is a composite sloop. Much in the same way, these are composite cargo vessels. So you'd have an iron or steel hull frame, keel, etc., but the hull itself, the hull, in this case, planking, or, if it was a steel or iron ship, the hull plating was wooden. And that's where the majority of the cost savings came from. There were a few, near enough pure wooden cargo ships built, but the mass-produced type were essentially a metal skeleton, which was then planked over. And to give you some idea of costs, the cost of building a wooden ship compared to a steel ship of approximately similar size was about half the all-metal ship, so it was quite cheap as well. But as for why other nations didn't try this, well, there was a limit to the size of cargo ship that you could build using this type of construction. And in the First World War, that wasn't so much of a problem. But when you look at the standard size of something like a Liberty or a Victory ship, building a composite ship of that kind of size might be pushing your luck. And the other problem is shipyard space. So in the US, they were able, both in World War I for these ships and for the Victory and Liberty ship programs later on, to not only fill quite extensive shipyards, but also just flat out build entire brand new shipyards with slipways and all of this to facilitate the construction of vessels. And in the UK, well, with such a long shipbuilding tradition, the UK shipyards weren't exactly short of slipways. The main problems were cost. Okay, that is eliminated somewhat with the wooden vessels, but also just manpower. And when you look over at Japan, which had only relatively recently modernized, you're just not going to have the total number of slipways or the trained manpower to actually build such vessels en masse. Yeah, you might see a slight increase in production versus just building steel merchant ships, but not a huge amount. And as I said, wooden cargo ships do have weaknesses, especially when you're talking about larger capacities and so forth. You've got to remember, when it comes to mass producing ships, there's lots of separate bottlenecks, like can you build enough machinery to power those ships in the first place? And then you have the slipway space and then the materials issues. So although building wooden-hulled ships might solve to a certain degree the materials and to a lesser degree cost issues, it doesn't do anything for your capability to produce the machinery sets to propel these vessels or to build the infrastructure to actually mass produce these vessels. And compared to Japan, the US definitely, and the UK to a slightly lesser extent, had just the sheer land capacity to facilitate the infrastructure and the precision industry to build en masse some form of propulsion, whether that be turbine, diesel, diesel electric, or vertical triple expansion. Daniel Regnard asks, the Santissima Trinidad is widely referred to as the largest warship in the world during the Trafalgar era. However, I was wondering, is this due to how many guns she had, or to her dimensions? And if it was due to her guns, what was the largest warship of the period, specifically at Trafalgar, by its dimensions? The status of Santissima Trinidad is a little bit fuzzy around the time of Trafalgar. It depends on how you quantify it. When she was launched, she was absolutely the largest warship in the world. However, by the time of Trafalgar, she had been surpassed in absolute dimensions by the Océan-class ships of the line of the French Navy. However, this is why it starts to get fuzzy, because how exactly do you define largest warship in the world? The Océans were just ever so fractionally longer and potentially, maybe a few inches wider. But after her conversion into a four-decker, Santissima Trinidad arguably probably displaced slightly more. She displaced fractionally less as a three-decker, but well, you stick another deck on and that's going to push your displacement up a fair bit, not to mention obviously all the extra guns you stick in. And then, of course, you also have the extra guns as mentioned, which puts her total armament numbers up, if not necessarily broadside weight, because that fourth deck wasn't exactly the world's heaviest set of guns. So in 1805, you could definitely argue she was the most heavily armed ship in the world by sheer number of guns and possibly by broadside firepower. And you could argue she's the largest ship in the world by displacement, but she's not quite by length. But at Trafalgar itself, specifically, she is the largest and most powerful vessel there, because the French don't bring any first rates to that particular fight. So the biggest thing they've got is an 80 gunner, and, well, Santissima Trinidad is both physically larger in dimensions, displacement, and, of course, more heavily armed than any of those. The heaviest things the British have brought to the fight are Victory and Royal Sovereign, and they are both smaller and carry fewer guns than Santissima Trinidad. So the only contender for Santissima Trinidad's top position is actually the other Spanish first rates, like Príncipe de Asturias and Santa Ana, and maybe to a certain extent Rayo, but not quite so much. And the Santa Ana class, although they are successors to Santissima Trinidad and fairly hefty vessels in their own right, are ever so slightly shorter and fractionally less beamy, and therefore also displace somewhat less than Santissima Trinidad, and being 3-deckers rather than 4-deckers, they don't have quite the same number of guns. So, although they are the second largest warships present, Santissima Trinidad at Trafalgar is definitely the largest and most heavily armed vessel that's there. JK50 with 10 asks, Drac, if you're given command of the Royal Navy just after the First London Naval Treaty, and you suspect that war is about a decade away, assuming that the Treasury Mandarins have been victims of a highly localised meteor strike, what would your ideal fleet be for World War II, and what changes to the Second London Treaty would you push for in order to achieve it? So I'm going to try and keep this one within the realms of, what a somewhat paranoid and suspicious First Sea Lord could possibly pull off during the 1930s, assuming that, that, as you said, the Treasury is mostly cowed. The two main changes that I would be pressing for in Second London would be, instead of pressing for a reduction in armament to 14 inches, I would either just argue to reduce, if we want to reduce at all, to 15 inches, because bearing in mind Second London was about, pressing things down still further. And I would be strongly against the restrictions of the light cruiser down to 8,000 tons and the dropping of tonnage for aircraft carriers. That would mean that I'd be free to either build more Ark Royal type aircraft carriers, or at least the Illustrious class would be a little bit larger, therefore able to carry more aircraft. Now, obviously, that implies a certain degree of expense, but as we said, the Treasury has been put aside for the minute. By only reducing guns from 16 to 15 instead of 16 to 14 inches, that allows me to have my 9 15-inch gun King George V type, as you can see here, World of Warships represented by the Monarch class. And as I mentioned in previous videos, one of the key reasons for that is not just because it's slightly larger guns, but it's specifically because the 15-inch 45 that the Royal Navy was developing was ever so slightly lighter than the 15-inch 42 due to advances in gun technology, but could fire exactly the same shells as the old 15-inch 42, which would mean that although the battleship building holiday is still in effect, I could start production of the 15-inch 45 well before that, and then en masse start a replacement program for pretty much every Royal Navy battleship and battlecruiser that isn't the Nelsons, and thus have everybody with brand new, far more capable guns and uniform across the fleet, and try and also get all the older ships up to a maximum elevation angle of 30 degrees while I'm doing it. So I now have bigger and more powerful aircraft carriers being built. I have a general upgrade across the fleet that, regardless of anything else, is going to make everybody far more capable. I'm also going to say, okay, we'll keep the 5.25-inch gun development going for the Dido class cruisers, But for my battleships, I'm just going to go with the 4.5 inch, the same that would go into the refits of Renown, etc. And obviously try and get Hood and Repulse refitted as well before the war breaks out, because I've got a bit more cash. Similarly, emphasize on getting the 4.5 inch as a dual purpose weapon developed as an upper deck mount so that I can also implement it on destroyers. Ideally aim to introduce it on the tribals and then on the J's and so forth thereafter. Push for the return of control of the fleet air arm earlier, and with the fact that I've hopefully managed to also argue against the 8,000 ton limit on cruisers, instead of developing the Crown Colony-Fiji type, I'm going to extend the run of Belfast-Edinburgh town class derivative cruisers, because they're going to be far more capable going forward. And yes, the Belfast type is slightly above the treaty limits, but hey, everybody else by this point we're pretty sure is cheating, except possibly the Americans, so we might as well cheat a little bit as well. And on that note, if I do have, relatively speaking, unlimited cash, I might also look at some of the designs that were being sketched up in the mid to late 30s for a revised heavy cruiser design. So essentially a county class successor, probably with 3 8.8 inch, and try and get some of those in production as well, because the Royal Navy was very short on cruisers during the war. And that also gives me options in theory, much like the Americans with the Clevelands and some of them being turned into independences, of if I have a large scale production of town class and county successors going as the 1930s draw to a close, I do then potentially have the option of creating a whole bunch of light carriers of reasonable capability relatively quickly if I need to. I'd also be investing a lot more of my available money in refits. So the R-Class, with the best will in the world, probably not worth fully refitting, but Barham and Malaya, as well as obviously Repulse and Hood, would ideally get modernized much sooner, albeit obviously we're talking about increased budget, not unlimited budget. So if I was forced to prioritize, I would say, okay, let's get Repulse, turn Repulse into essentially another Renown. Let's get Hood done as well. We'll keep Warspite, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth under process. But if push comes to shove, rather than getting Barham and Malaya upgraded, I'd actually exchange that for a partial modernization, because they don't need it quite as much, on Nelson and Rodney. So full machinery overhaul, so poor old Rodney doesn't face the issues that she does in the early part of the war, together with probably wholesale replacement of the secondary and AA batteries. So instead of having a mixture of 4.7s and 6s, just go with lots and lots of 4.5s. Warrant Officer Will asks, how did incidents like the action of August the 9th in 1780, aka when Santissima Trinidad and friends made an utter laughingstock out of the East India Trading Company, have an impact on their reputation in the colonies? Did word ever reach India? How did people who'd been on the wrong side of the East India Company around the world react to this humiliation against the company? It greatly depended on exactly when such incidents took place and what the cargoes were. The incident you refer to, the action of August 9th, 1780, was a particularly bad one because of the nature of the cargo and when it took place. Potentially having a very crippling impact on the British war effort in their sort of general war with, at the time, the 13 colonies plus France plus Spain plus everybody else who wanted to get in on the act. It's, in and of itself, it can seem a little bit odd, because although the capture of a large portion of enemy convoy in the Age of Sail was not, it's not common, but it's not unheard of. It's not particularly unusual. That kind of thing would happen a few times during any given war. But as I said, a lot of it depends on the timing and the contents, because if it's a general convoy that's been formed up when both sides' finances are in relatively good condition, then it's bad, but it's not the end of the world. Whereas if it's a convoy primarily full of military and naval supplies at a point when the country who owns that convoy, in this case the UK, is struggling to hold down all its various theatres, then the impact of the strategic loss of materials, as well as the loss of ships and the commensurate financial impacts on insurance rates and the people who'd invested in those ships, can be exponentially more than just the on-paper figures would suggest. So if it was sort of one of the first cases where it's like, oh, that's annoying, then most people who'd been on the wrong side of the East India Company, actually, to be honest, would not so much look forward to the consequences, because at that point, the East India Company, being a business, would look to make its money back from somewhere. And, well, if you've been on the wrong side of the East India Company before, guess what? They're probably going to try and gouge you for even more money, or pay you less money, or, otherwise exploit you in order to try and make good their losses. Whereas something like this, which actually, can have a very serious impact on a nation's finances and on the East India Company in particular, then you might rejoice a little bit more, because there's a somewhat greater chance that the privations you've endured at the hands of the East India Company might not occur for too much longer, because the potential war-changing course of events would mean that maybe the area that you're currently in would now come under the control of a different power. Although whether exploitation by the French, the Spanish, or the Dutch was preferable to exploitation by the British, I'll leave that open to those of you who've studied that in greater detail. But since the East India Company was just one of several different entities caught up in this action and others, when it comes to mass convoy seizures, either by the French, or in this case the Spanish against the British, or by the British against the French or the Spanish, to be honest, the greatest blowback tends to be on a national scale rather than against an individual company that may have some ships within said convoy. Deeks25 asks, does the Goteborg have any kind of engine, or is she completely sail only? I understand some sailing yachts require a backup engine, but is this true for the replica? Although relying almost exclusively on sail, the Goteborg replica, or Gothenburg replica, does have a couple of diesel engines connected to a couple of propeller shafts. And essentially this is for two reasons. Firstly, it's a useful emergency backup in case of a situation that would ordinarily wreck the ship. So, of course, a pure sail vessel, especially an ocean-going sail vessel, if it's caught in a really, really heavy storm, might be driven ashore and wrecked, and there's not a huge amount they can do about that. But if you have propulsion systems, you can fight against said storm. So, for safety, that's there. And also because in some harbours, there are quite heavy restrictions on what a purely sail-powered vessel, especially one of her size, can and can't do, when they can and can't come in, where they can and can't dock, etc., etc. And as a result, in order to avoid all the legal and time shenanigans, that's the other reason why she has a pair of propellers, because if they're going to absolutely insist that you have at least the option, if not necessarily the use of engines to access docks and harbours a bit more regularly in some areas, then it's better to have them and be allowed in and hopefully not need them than to not have them and end up having to sit outside for a very particular set of conditions. But from what I gathered, speaking to the crew in Gothenburg, it's essentially a case of if emergency or legal circumstances absolutely force their use, then they will use the engines. But if they have any other option, they prefer to use the sails. Laminat asks, naval battle paintings often show ships' sails riddled with holes all the way to the top, at heights exceeding the depicted engagement range. Is this just artistic license, or was the gun elevation really that good? In a typical Age of Sail naval battle, you would see more shot holes through the sails lower down, but, as you can see in this example, having shot holes all the way through to the higher sails is not, in fact, at all unrealistic. And in fact, we have a few surviving sails from some engagements that were mounted pretty high in the ships that show various holes. The reason for this, it can be from a number of different factors. Firstly, especially with longer range fire, you've got to bear in mind that cannon of the period are going to have to be elevated somewhat if you're shooting at 500 to 1,000, maybe even 1,500 yards, you're going to have to elevate it a little bit to drop the wall where you want it to go. So there's already a degree of elevation involved there. And so, for example, if the ship then, by the time it's firing its second or third broadside, has closed the range quite significantly, well, the guns might still be aimed slightly high because there may not have been the time to change that. Then you've also got the fact that we're not talking about the precision fit shells of the late 19th century. We're talking about an era where you have windage, i.e., potentially up to 1/3 of an inch or more either side of the shot, which is therefore going to be not going in a perfectly straight line. So, for example, if you're engaging at a long distance and let's say you've aimed your gun at, I don't know, let's say 5 degrees upwards, well, when you fire that shot, it may be actually leaving the barrel at anything from 3 degrees upwards to 8 degrees upwards, for sake of argument. And then you've got the fact that quite often, especially when you're talking classic age of sail, if you're the French, you might be aiming for the ship's rigging and sails and masts. So you're already aiming to fire somewhat high anyway, factor in the dispersion, and all of a sudden, again, you've got shot going through the upper portions of the sails. And you've got to take into account that up until you've got flintlock mechanisms for firing the cannon, if you're relying on sort of slow match and so forth, the ship is rolling. And so if you're in a relatively moderate sea, even so, your ship's roll, especially if you're broadside onto the waves, might be quite significant. And so you're going to try and estimate when you're going to shoot, but you're not necessarily going to land that exactly. So, worst case scenario, you might be aiming, let's say, at the masts and the rigging and perhaps some of the lower sails that are actually unfurled, because bear in mind in battle sail usually the lowest sails are furled up, and the ship's rolling quite severely, and maybe you light the firing on the uproll because you're aiming for the masts anyway, and you're just a fraction late in putting your slow match to the gun, and by fluke, some of the rounds are coming out a little bit high anyway, because as we said with the windage, that can easily end up with a bunch of your shot going quite high and either going over the ship in question or punching holes in the uppermost of the sails. Now, of course, if you're up close and personal, that's not going to happen, but at the 500,000 yard engagement distance, it's entirely possible that's going to happen, and that's just with one gun. So if you're talking about multiple broadsides by multiple ships, and each broadside is going to be 30, 40, 50 guns, suddenly there's an awful lot of shot holes appearing in those upper sails, although obviously, generally speaking, this is going to be considerably fewer than would be appearing in the lower sails and in the hulls of the ships in question. Imprison Grover Fur asks, Drachinifel, would you say that the reputation of the Regia Marina has swung too far in the other direction in terms of being regarded as very competent, given their strategy of seldom attempting any decisive blows against, say, Malta and or Gibraltar, which were a must for any Italian victory in World War II? Italian naval strategy essentially dooming Italy to a slow defeat from the start. It is always possible to overstate the effectiveness of the Regia Marina. It's possible to overstate or understate anybody's effectiveness. However, I would say it is probably going to depend very much on what level people are talking about, because the things that you mentioned with things like the failure to take out Malta or to attack Gibraltar and so on and so forth, these are strategic level issues as opposed to tactical level issues. And what I mean by that is the overall goals, aims, and operations of a navy during a war can be broadly described as their strategic options, whereas how good the ships are, or submarines, are at actually accomplishing those goals is very much more of a tactical thing, at least in the way that I discuss things. So, can they shoot straight? Are the crews halfway decent at their jobs? What is their success 1v1? That kind of stuff is tactical, whereas, did they succeed at taking out Gibraltar? Although if they had launched such an operation, it would be in certain ways dictated by the tactical competence of the Italian Navy. It's much more of a strategic issue, because you could have the most competent navy on the planet, but if the admirals in charge, so that's in terms of capability of fighting their ships, but if the admirals in charge just don't go for the place, well, that's a strategic problem that doesn't actually reflect the fighting capacity of the fleet, more the decision making at the top. And I think to a great degree those two things have to be separated. You can argue quite a bit about the strategic competency of the Regia Marina, obviously somewhat constrained by the availability of fuel and so forth. But I think it's fair to say that strategically speaking, the Regia Marina did not make the greatest decisions. Where I tend to focus in terms of, if you like, rehabilitating their reputation compared to what it might have been 10, 15, 20 years before in popular culture, is the idea that the actual ships and the crews were incompetent. The idea that, they'd show up, they'd fire a few shots at the Royal Navy, and then they'd run away, which is not the case. And, as I've said on the channel previously, there's almost, especially in the early to middle part of the war, an inversely proportional relationship between the seniority of the Italian officer on the scene and the success that the Italian Navy enjoys, i.e. small-scale operations, special forces, cruisers, destroyers, sometimes submarines, but more along the lines of the smaller ones, not so much the larger ones, etc. In those cases, the Italians tend to acquit themselves fairly well, if not outright win, especially with things like Mars boats. Conversely, as you scale things up and up and up to sort of fleet-scale engagements where you have full admirals in command, regardless of how many stars they might have behind them, they tend to start doing worse and worse. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. A fair number of small-scale Italian operations went disastrously wrong. A few of their larger-scale operations went somewhat better. But overall, I think it's fair to say that the Regia Marina were a fairly competent and fairly powerful navy that the Allies had to take very seriously, which is a very different story to the one that's been told perhaps for the majority of the post-World War II period. Now, their strategic guidance, that's a lot more questionable, but ultimately, as I've said a few times before on the channel, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the main threat they thought the Kriegsmarine was going to provide would be the occasional U-boat and some small fast attack craft. The capital ships that were present at D-Day were there pretty much exclusively to shoot up the landscape, whereas when the Allies landed at Salerno or at Sicily, there were a lot more Allied battleships, and a good chunk of them were positioned in a very specific group designed to safeguard the landings from potential predations by the Regia Marina. They were far more concerned about the Italians coming out to try and disrupt the landings by brute force than they ever were about the Kriegsmarine doing the same thing. Classe Cornate asks, could you rank the 5 ships of the Charles Martel class from worst to best, or at least most horrible to least horrible? So, to be clear, this is referring to the loose grouping of 5 ships, occasionally called a class, occasionally called the Fleet of Experiments, or whatever you want. In a lot of ways, apart from 1 or 2 outlier examples, potentially the worst offenders in the realm of French pre-dreadnoughts. So, starting off with, and this is all subjectively my opinion, number 5, the worst of the 5 would be the Carnot, as you can see here. Partially because of that hilariously offensively large superstructure - upper hull and the truly insane number of portholes or scuttles that are present, which attracted a lot of controversy and criticism back in the day as well, because, well, you can tell by how low that last row is. The belt is exceptionally low in the water, and thus, any degree of flooding and therefore any list to the ship, and that first row, well, that's compromised your watertight integrity almost immediately. So almost regardless of anything else, that would net a very unfavourable rating. But considering that none of these ships have particularly brilliant stability, this has potentially the worst of them, and so that's why she's down in number 5. Next up, we have the Messena. Now, there are a few things to recommend Messena, like the fact she's the one that introduces triple screw propulsion to French battleships, whereas those that went previous to her, including the majority of this grouping, actually have twin screw propulsion. However, we're kind of in the middle of the pack now, and broadly speaking, she seemed to have been regarded in the Marine Nationale as not a particularly brilliant vessel. She's a little bit slower than most of the others, and she did have a number of mechanical issues. So, although there's nothing particularly like Carnot to point to and say this is a really, really, really terrible element of it, she's probably the least good of the middle of the pack, hence why she's at number 4. And then we have Charles Martel itself, the first of them. As you can see, this kind of, extreme tumble home, lots of scuttles, etc., is pretty much common across most of the fleet, or most of this section. She has got a very heavily built up superstructure above the hull, which is a mark against, but she is at 18 knots, which is what she's supposed to be, unlike Messena, and therefore she gets the number 3 spot. Plus, she didn't have quite as many mechanical issues and was generally slightly better received in French service. At number 2, we have the last of the class, which is the Bouvet. Now, she does have a number of additional advantages over the other ships in the class, but some of those are due mainly to the fact that she's just built somewhat larger than the rest of them. And some is just due to the fact that she's, well, as I said, the last, therefore she benefits from the most technological advancements. So, for example, she has a somewhat better grade of armour. Pretty much everybody else is using, for the majority, nickel steel Crusoe armour, whereas Bouvet is using the French equivalent of Harvey steel. So she's somewhat better protected, which means she manages to save weight. She takes 50 millimeters off of the belt, so it goes down from 450 to 400 millimeters, or from just under 18 inches to just under 16 inches, without a loss of overall protection, assuming that the belt is hit. She's also the other one of the 5 to introduce triple screw propulsion, although she is obviously the second one to adopt that. And she also introduces significant use of electrical power to a number of the ship's guns and so forth. So she's a relatively advanced vessel, but the reason she's at number 2 is partially, as I said, a lot of this is bought purely by the fact she has a few hundred more tons of displacement to throw around, not because her design is any better, but she's kept at number 2 for the fact that she has, admittedly in common with most of the rest of the class, hilariously terrible stability, and unlike the rest, this was actually proven in combat when she struck a mine, rolled over and sank inside of 2 minutes during the First World War. And that means that top of the rather questionable pack is the unpronounceable one, the Jaureguiberi, something like that. I mean, I've met French people who have looked at that word and gone, I have no clue. So, yeah, the one that begins with J. Now, although she has some disadvantages compared to one or two of the ones we've looked at earlier, obviously she's got the standard Crusoe steel armor and she's only got 2-shaft propulsion, she does introduce a number of rather innovative features. So you can see either side of the bridge in this photo, her tertiary battery of 138mm or 5.4-inch guns is mounted in twin turrets rather than singles, so that's a big thumbs up from me, quite innovative. Also, she is somewhat shorter but somewhat beamier than her contemporaries, which means that of all 5 ships, she's the one with the best stability and agility. So major props, especially considering, obviously, as we just said before, what happened to Bouvet. She also has minimal to no scuttles on the 3rd row. She's got a, relatively speaking, inoffensive upper superstructure. And so, yeah, broadly speaking, I think she's probably the best of all 5 ships. You can argue the technical details of her versus Bouvet, but at the end of the day, if they were to slug it out with each other, I would actually put my money on this ship because, protection and firepower-wise, they're within the same ballpark of each other, except that as the damage adds up, Bouvet is much more likely to roll over and sink very quickly, whereas this vessel will probably stay on the surface just that little bit longer. Paul from Chicago asks, where is the Royal Navy Admiralty building during the various periods the channel covers? Well, for almost the entire time that there even is an official Admiralty building, it's been in the same place. So in the UK, that's collectively known as the Admiralty buildings. They're now known as different names because the Admiralty as an organisation at the top of the tree doesn't exist. It's now subsumed into the Ministry of Defence. But they're all basically around Whitehall. There's just this whole bunch of buildings. You can see some of them from the Thames. Now, the current structures, because there's a whole series of buildings, the current structures started being built in the early 1700s, but they actually went over the site of the first officially planned Admiralty building, i.e. something that was built and said this is going to be the headquarters for the Admiralty, which was done in the late 1600s, but as I said, pretty much on the same site. The problem was that particular building just wasn't large enough. Well, it was large enough initially, but became too small very quickly, hence the development of the first major Admiralty building, which is the one you can see on screen now. Prior to that, there wasn't an official designated, this is the Admiralty headquarters. It could be where the government decided it was going to be, it could be in general government buildings, or it could be the house or London House or residential palace elsewhere of whoever happened to be Lord High Admiral at the time, depending on circumstances. So if you're talking about periods where, say, one of the royal family was Lord High Admiral, then at that point the Admiralty, before the creation of these buildings, the Admiralty would just be, well, they live in that palace, so I guess this is also the Admiralty building. Whereas if it was someone who'd come up through the ranks and really didn't have a house big enough, then some portion of one of the royal palaces, wherever the government was based at the time, would be temporarily become kind of an Admiralty wing or something, if you like. The Admiralty would, of course, have various subsidiary buildings on a somewhat more permanent basis for organising things like supplies and ordnance and so forth, but as an overall headquarters, it was pretty much a moving and unofficial thing until the establishment of these buildings in Whitehall, which then continued to be the headquarters for the Admiralty until the Admiralty was subsumed, as I said, into the Ministry of Defence. John Ashley asks, during World War I, how did the Royal Navy enforce its blockade against the Central Powers with respect to ships sailing to or from ports in the neutral Netherlands? Once the blockade was properly up and running, there was a fairly sophisticated, multi-layered way of dealing with the situation. Now, of course, as a neutral power, fully blockading the Netherlands was not an acceptable option. However, they came up with, as I said, several systems to try and limit how much goods could be imported into Germany via the Netherlands. Now, of course, it's never perfect, but one of the things they would do is, the more obvious thing, they were able to a certain extent, dictate what could and couldn't sail to the Netherlands. So you could inspect ships bound for the Netherlands before they made their final voyage, and if they carried contraband of war, then those cargoes could be confiscated regardless of whether they were sailing to a neutral country or not. So things like explosives and armaments, guns and so forth, or the components thereunto, the British could turn around and say, well, the only reason for a ship to be transporting, 5,000 tons of nitroglycerin or something like that would be for use in warlike industries. The Dutch government has not ordered 5,000 tons of nitroglycerin, therefore we can only conclude that you are intending to supply this to Germany, and therefore under our rights as a combatant, we're not going to let you do that. And the same thing obviously would go for rifles, bullets, that kind of stuff, the more obvious stuff. So assuming that it's not that, and the ship is allowed to then head towards the Netherlands, you then have to, the fact that you have to notify the British ahead of time that you are doing this because there are various minefields and patrols and so forth, so you have to get clearance, and the various British ships need to know to let you proceed unmolested. And this limits rather dramatically the possibility of a ship sailing for the Netherlands and then, skedaddling eastwards at the last minute, because if you tried that, you'd run into a minefield and explode. Now, of course, that does leave some things. So things like food could not be usually considered contraband of war, and absolutely couldn't be considered contraband if it was going to a neutral country. So there was a possibility that the Germans might order foodstuffs via subsidiaries in the Netherlands, which would then be transported there, and then could be transported overland to Germany. So the British had a few options there as well. Firstly, if the Netherlands looked like it was going to produce a surplus of food, and they did this with various other countries as well, then the British would come up to them and say, well, you know what? Grain on the international market is, say, trading for 3 guineas and 2pence a tonne. How about we give you 3 guineas and 2 shillings per tonne, which is more than anyone else is going to offer you? And, of course, at that point, being a neutral power, most people, including Dutch producers, would go, well, you know what? More money is better for us, so great. We shall sell you our surplus for slightly above market rate. We'll get a ton of money, you get a bunch of food, and as far as the British are concerned, this is good because it means Germany is not getting said food. And the same would go for an awful lot of other goods that might be produced in surplus, and was actually where a good chunk of the British financial expenditure for the war went. Obviously not a majority, but it was still a significant line item. But this is historically how Britain has defeated European land powers, partly by direct military force, but also partially by exercising economic might to starve them out. Now, that's the more direct method, or methods, and then you have a few indirect methods, the two primary ones being that if you suspected that some goods were being bought by the Netherlands or by companies within the Netherlands for further transmission on to the Germans, then you could put a certain amount of diplomatic pressure up to and including things like, well, if you're going to covertly trade with Germany, technically speaking, that is within your right as a neutral power. However, technically speaking, it is within our right to decide to trade with somebody else. And since you rely on trade with Britain considerably more than you rely on trade with Germany, it might be in your favour to not trade so much with Germany. And if you don't trade with Germany, well, you never know. We might have some slack in our coastal merchant fleet which might be able to trade with you. Economic leverage. The other method was simply the fact that Britain owned most of the coaling ports across the planet and had the finances to buy up most of the coal in areas where it didn't have a majority or monopolistic control. And so if there was a particular ship that was moving goods and that you were pretty darn sure were probably going to be shipped to the Germans once they got landed, but there technically wasn't anything wrong with them in and of themselves, so you couldn't confiscate them as contraband, well, then that ship might suddenly discover that, no, I'm afraid this port doesn't have any coal for you. You're just going to have to wait for the next shipment. And yes, there's 50,000 tons of coal sitting there on the dockside, but that's all been bought and paid for by somebody else. And no, we can't tell you who that is. Financial confidentiality agreement and all this. So, coal exists in this facility, but you can't buy any of it. I guess you're just going to have to wait. And, oh yes, well, you're carrying perishable goods. That is a tragedy. Well, if you sell them locally, you can at least make some money back, but we really don't care about the fact that you really wanted to take those over to Antwerp or wherever. That's not really our problem. Wait a couple of months for the next collier to come in, then you can sail. And those kind of slightly underhand shenanigans could keep a lot of ships that were probably bound for Germany, at least indirectly, away from Germany for a considerable portion of time, either until the cargo had spoiled or until they decided to sell up and go elsewhere. Now, none of this is completely perfect, as said, so a few things did slip through, but it generally was pretty effective at cutting the Netherlands out of being able to ship goods to Germany via its land border. Cameron Rogers asks, what is a more challenging business, running a historic museum ship or running a historical YouTube channel? As challenging as running a channel might be, running a museum ship is exponentially harder. For one thing, if you're going to run it relatively responsibly, you have the fact that as a museum ship, you also have to be a historian to a certain degree, at least a historian of your own ship in quite extensive detail, and perhaps more generally a historian of the navy that ship was part of, and to an even lesser degree, but still somewhat significant, a historian of the navies that your ship potentially fought against. So you still have to be a historian to some degree or other, as a minimum. Plus, of course, I can sit here in my office making videos and going out and doing research, but at the end of the day, unless something's gone dramatically wrong with the laws of physics, I don't have to worry about coming back to my house and discovering that it's sunk at its moorings. Yes, you have to do house maintenance, but the maintenance to keep a museum ship afloat is considerably greater. Plus, you have to worry about payroll, all the staff you've got on board, visitor numbers. If it starts absolutely hammering it down with rain, I can just go, well, that's unfortunate. Let's just hope it's not catastrophic levels of rain such that it gets loud enough I can't record a video. Whereas if you are a museum ship in that situation, well, how many leaks have you now got? Where are those leaks going? What damage is it doing to your ship? I guess you're going to have to do all this work to plug those various leaks, but you're also going to not have that many visitors that day. So where's the money going to come from to pay for it? And depending on which nation you happen to be in, you might also have to be dealing with local politics to make sure that the funding keeps coming to your ship, or that the rental fees for your mooring are still going to be fairly reasonable, and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, if somebody decides they want to show up and be extremely obnoxious about every single minor rivet counting detail that they think you've got wrong about your museum ship, to a limited degree, you kind of have to sit there and bear it if you're running a museum ship. Whereas if someone comes up to me and does that, I would just be like, well, who are you and what are you doing at my front door? Please go away, or the police will be called if they get too bad. So yeah, running a museum ship, significantly more challenging, all things considered. But that's not to say running a channel and keeping the history content actually accurate as best as you can isn't challenging. It very much is. But there's a difference between that and having to actually keep a ship literally afloat, often with not necessarily as much money as you would like. Patrick Donnelly asks, in one of your previous Drydocks, you implied that the entirety of the Marine Nationale joining the Royal Navy outright, so no Mersel Kapir, would result in much evil laughter. What would the reaction of the other navies be, or how would they react if the Marine Nationale joined them? I think for the Axis powers, for both elements, the reactions would be about the same across the board. So, obviously for the Axis navies, the Marine Nationale sailing wholesale to join the Royal Navy would be, that's a problem. We thought we got rid of them. Now we have to deal with, a much larger Royal Navy, and all those annoying friendships we thought we weren't going to have to deal with, well, now we have to deal with them only under a single unified command structure. Conversely, if the Marine Nationale had arbitrarily decided to join one of the Axis navies, with the potential exception of the Kriegsmarine, it wouldn't necessarily be quite as welcome as you'd think, because all three Axis navies, to varying degrees, had significant issues with fueling the navy that they actually had. So handing them the entire Marine Nationale is essentially handing them a fine, because you're saying, well, here's a bunch of ships, but even assuming you can hand wave aside the logistical issues of operating all the different technologies and finding crews and so forth, how are you going to fuel them? Now, there would be some advantage because you could pick and choose which ships you wanted to operate, so perhaps you could drop out some of your less well-performing or older vessels and bring in the French vessels, or perhaps keep them in reserve for when you inevitably will lose some ships. So, for example, some of the smaller Italian cruisers and destroyers, they might get sidelined in favour of bringing in some of the French cruisers and destroyers, and likewise the Italians might decide to put the Duilios or Cavours into a kind of a secondary reserve role and use the Dunkirks and Richelieu. And the same thing would happen perhaps with the Japanese. The Germans might be fractionally happier, mostly because they've got some way of, rebuilding their somewhat savage destroyer corps. And hey, they actually have some cruisers now, but they're probably the least well off in terms of amount of fuel available. So, swings and roundabouts for them, which kind of leaves the Americans, who would be the most interesting, I think. Obviously, if the French just wholesale joined the US Navy, then, well, as far as the Americans are concerned, hey, bunch more ships, that's fantastic, more things to throw at the Japanese in, well, about a year or so's time. But the American reaction to the Marine Nationale joining the Royal Navy, I think, would be mixed. On the one hand, it means that the British are in a stronger position to fight the Axis, which is in America's interests, which is good. And at least until Japan gets stuck into the war, it means also a larger number of ships the British might send to America for refit, which obviously means they get paid more money, which is also good. Conversely, for some in the US, particularly people like Admiral King and a lot of politicians who really don't like the British Empire in principle and would rather see it taken down a notch or several, the idea that the British might be able to hold on to more of their colonial possessions and or retake them in a quicker and more organised manner, because they now essentially have a far more powerful fleet, that would be less welcome news. I suspect that would probably be put on the back burner until towards the end of the war, but a potentially heavily strengthened Royal Navy, or more correctly Royal Navy with very large Free French Navy attachments, which obviously would also be on the lookout for securing France's colonial interests, that might meet significantly more political resistance as the war winds down and it becomes less and less of can we beat the Axis and more a case of what shape do we want the world order to look like after we've beaten the Axis. And that wraps us up for this week, everybody. Just a quick heads up going into December, because obviously this is November's dry docks, but going into December, for December and possibly January, I'll be reverting briefly to the covering 2 weeks worth of videos in one dry dock, just to catch up a little bit, because obviously we drift slightly doing 1 week for one dry dock because of the Patreon dry dock at the end of each month. So heads up for that. And as you can guess by the fact you're listening to this, I survived my trip to Italy and my trip to the US, and I'm back in the UK hopefully for quite a while now. So I'll be looking at organising some museum ship tours in the UK, much as I did the one in Portsmouth Dockyard a while back, for people who are interested in coming along to one of those. And hopefully we'll also be able to catch up on the Patreon Drydock live streams as well, so look out for notifications of those coming up. Anyway, let's get on with our day, shall we?